During the Second World War, the ability to deceive the enemy became almost as crucial as the deployment of actual weaponry. Among the more sophisticated and fascinating examples of deception were the fake airfields constructed by the Germans, designed specifically to mislead Allied bombing raids. Unlike the dramatic and well-known uses of camouflage in tanks or ships, these aerodrome deceptions were entirely artificial landscapes, meticulously crafted illusions that aimed to divert expensive American bombers and pilots into wasting their ordnance on empty fields. The strategic purpose behind these constructions was simple yet effective: to protect vital infrastructure, aircraft production facilities, and operational airbases from destruction. Every bomb dropped on a false target meant fewer losses for the Luftwaffe and reduced disruption to German war operations. The concept of the dummy airfield, or Täuschungsflugplatz, as it was known in German military terminology, had its roots in the interwar period. Military engineers and planners understood that the visibility of airstrips from the air made them inherently vulnerable. During the First World War, rudimentary mock-ups of airfields were sometimes used to mislead reconnaissance planes, but it was in the Second World War that the technique was refined to an art form. The German approach combined industrial ingenuity, psychological manipulation, and an understanding of aerial photography's limitations. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Luftwaffe engineers had developed detailed plans for creating artificial airfields that could mimic the appearance of active bases, even under close observation by Allied reconnaissance planes. A typical fake airfield consisted of multiple components designed to simulate the functional features of a real airbase. This included mock runways, aircraft, hangars, and ground vehicles. Runways were often constructed from simple materials such as wooden planks, painted asphalt substitutes, or even compacted earth designed to reflect sunlight in a manner similar to real tarmac. In some cases, painted lines were used to emulate runway markings. These runways were intentionally slightly smaller than real ones, since the goal was not to enable actual takeoffs and landings, but simply to provide visual cues from a distance. Surrounding the runways, engineers would place decoy aircraft, constructed from wood, canvas, or metal, arranged in patterns that resembled operational deployment. Some of these planes were equipped with rudimentary rotating mechanisms or reflective surfaces to simulate activity and shine like real metal under the sun. Beyond static displays, lighting played a critical role in enhancing the illusion, especially for nighttime reconnaissance and bombing missions. Engineers developed complex arrangements of dummy runway lights, often wired to small generators. These lights were designed to flicker in ways that suggested operational readiness, creating the impression of activity when seen from high altitudes. In some notable instances, the Germans even installed small fires or flares to simulate anti-aircraft activity and personnel movement. The combination of lights, shadows, and cleverly placed mock-ups created a three-dimensional illusion that, from the air, could convincingly deceive the enemy's visual and photographic reconnaissance. Psychological manipulation was another key factor. German planners understood that American and British aircrews were trained to recognize patterns of activity, the number of aircraft, and ground movement to assess whether a target was viable. Decoy airfields were therefore designed with careful attention to these cues. Aircraft were positioned as though ready for takeoff. Maintenance crews were suggested through painted or wooden figurines, and fuel trucks or artillery were mimicked to suggest operational status. The Germans were essentially designing a visual narrative for the bomber crews, telling the story of a busy, functioning airbase. This narrative was critical. Once the Allied crews believed they had found an authentic target, they would release bombs, confident that their efforts were striking at the heart of enemy air power.
Historical records document several striking examples of these deceptions. One prominent case occurred in the Ruhr region, where Germany's industrial heartland was heavily targeted by American and British air forces. Engineers constructed an elaborate series of dummy airfields around real industrial zones, complete with wooden aircraft arranged in realistic flight patterns. In at least one documented instance, reconnaissance photos showed what appeared to be fully operational Messerschmitt Bf-109s lined up on the tarmac. In reality, the planes were nothing more than painted wooden models. When American bombers arrived, the targets were hit, only for the crews to realize afterward that the devastation they believed they had inflicted was largely illusory. While exact statistics are hard to determine, these operations are estimated to have diverted significant numbers of bombs from actual industrial and military targets, conserving German resources and protecting key infrastructure. The scale and sophistication of these fake airfields varied according to strategic priority and available resources. Smaller decoys might consist of only a single runway with a handful of wooden aircraft, intended to attract minor reconnaissance or diversionary attacks. Larger installations could span several hundred meters, including multiple runways, taxiways, parking areas, and the appearance of maintenance activity. Engineers even employed techniques such as altering terrain contours to mimic bomb craters from previous attacks, adding another layer of realism. Some decoy airfields were integrated into broader camouflage schemes, surrounded by false roads, dummy fuel depots, and even painted shadows to simulate hangars. The cumulative effect was to create an environment so convincing that it could withstand scrutiny from both day and night aerial reconnaissance missions. The operational impact of these decoy airfields on American bombing campaigns is well documented. Pilots and navigators often relied on visual cues, maps, and aerial photographs to locate targets. In cases where decoys were successfully deployed, bomber formations would approach, identify what appeared to be a legitimate airbase, and release their payloads, sometimes dropping dozens of tons of bombs on empty fields. While the overall strategic effect did not decisively alter the course of the war, it did impose operational costs on the Allies, wasted munitions, lost flight hours, and the need for replanning missions. Furthermore, the psychological impact on aircrews, who could not always confirm the success of their attacks, introduced uncertainty and caution into subsequent operations. When examining German decoy airfields in comparison with other forms of wartime deception, several features stand out. Unlike traditional camouflage, which seeks to hide or blend in, decoy airfields were designed to attract attention deliberately, to create false intelligence for enemy planners. This proactive approach to deception, crafting entire installations to mislead rather than merely conceal, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of both human perception and aerial reconnaissance technology. The Germans, in essence, created an aerial illusion theater where every component served to reinforce the narrative of a functioning, vital military target. By combining careful material selection, intelligent layout, lighting, and psychological manipulation, German military engineers were able to transform simple fields into convincing replicas of operational air bases. These efforts were supported by a culture of innovation and improvisation, leveraging every available resource to exploit the limitations of Allied reconnaissance and bombing strategies. The result was a series of operations that, while ultimately a defensive measure, showcased the creativity and technical skill applied to wartime deception.
When we move from the craftsmanship of deception to its consequences, the conversation shifts from artistry to arithmetic. How many bombs were wasted? How many flight hours consumed? What strategic decisions were distorted? And ultimately, whether the effort paid off. The effectiveness of German dummy airfields must be judged on several axes: tactical diversion, operational cost imposed on the Allies, psychological impact on aircrews and commanders, and the durability of the deception as Allied reconnaissance and attack methods evolved. Taken together, these measures give a nuanced picture. Dummy aerodromes rarely changed the course of campaigns, but they produced real operational frictions and measurable savings for the German war effort. Tactical results are the most immediate metric. When a bomber formation identified a convincing decoy, the immediate consequence was bombs delivered to an empty field instead of a factory, hangar, or fuel dump.
Contemporary reports and post-war assessments indicate that single raids sometimes dropped tens to hundreds of tons of explosives on such false targets. To put that in perspective, a typical B-17 Flying Fortress carried roughly 6,000 pounds, approximately 2.7 metric tons, of bombs on medium-range missions, while B-24s could carry somewhat more. Therefore, a single 100-plane raid might deliver roughly 270 to 300 tons of ordnance. If a convincing decoy attracted even a small formation, the material cost to the Allies in expended munitions and lost opportunity to damage real infrastructure was significant. Several Allied mission debriefs include bitter passages about arriving over target and finding nothing but shell holes and smoking canvas dummies. Those debriefs are testimony to the tactical success of particular decoy setups. Operational costs went beyond the immediate loss of explosives. Bomber sorties were expensive in crew risk, aircraft hours, and logistical strain. Each strategic bombing mission required planning resources, intelligence updates, fuel, spare parts, and aircrew risk. When a sortie failed to hit a real target because of deception, the accumulated cost multiplied. Repeated exposures to deceptive targets forced Allied planners to alter tactics. More reconnaissance was ordered. More photo interpretation cross-checks were required. And mission planners sometimes delayed strikes pending better verification. Delays and reroutings mattered. They consumed precious daylight windows, reduced sortie rates, and in some cases, postponed attacks until weather or operational priorities changed. The psychological dimension is less visible in raw numbers, but arguably as important. Air crews developed skepticism. Were those planes real metal or painted wood? Was that runway authentic or painted strip? That doubt could lead to conservative decision-making, altitudes altered to verify, bomb runs adjusted to prioritize clearer targets, or outright mission aborts when uncertainty grew. The strategic effect was twofold. First, German defenses benefited through distraction. Decoys pulled attention and munitions away from vital nodes. Second, the Allies had to invest in better reconnaissance and target confirmation systems, which consumed time and intelligence assets. In short, deception forced the Allies to pay attention, a resource cost that is easy to overlook, but real on campaign scales. Concrete examples illustrate how these dynamics played out. In the industrial belts of the Reich, where the German war economy was most vulnerable, decoy networks were strategically employed as several layered systems. A real factory might be surrounded by a perimeter of dummy installations meant to confuse approach bearings, a false airfield a few kilometers away, painted service roads, and dummy storage facilities. Bomber crews arriving from high altitude could focus on the most visible feature, the decoy airfield, especially under cloud cover or twilight. Some raids recorded by Allied logs show aircraft returning with half loads expended on what were later identified as feints. While it is difficult to assign precise percentages to bombs wasted on decoys across the entire air campaign, historians estimate that dozens, possibly hundreds of medium-sized raids through 1942 to 1944 experienced at least partial misdirection due to decoys and camouflage schemes.
Allied reaction evolved over time. Early in the strategic bombing campaigns, visual identification played a dominant role. Crews and navigators used recognizable shapes, runway patterns, and visible aircraft to confirm targets. As deception proved effective, the Allies placed growing emphasis on photographic reconnaissance, multi-angle imagery, and signals intelligence. Photo interpreters learned to spot telltale signs of fakery. lack of consistent wear patterns on runways, absence of vehicular tracks, unrealistic shadowing on mock aircraft, and the absence of auxiliary activity like small vehicles, fuel stains, or heat signatures. Technology helped. Infrared and later radar reconnaissance reduced the advantage of purely visual decoys. Allied photo reconnaissance also began to incorporate temporal analysis, comparing images across days to see whether aircraft moved, whether lights were ever on at night, and whether the pattern of activity matched logistical logic. This process raised the bar for successful deception. What fooled a daylight visual attack in 1941 was less likely to fool an integrated reconnaissance effort by 1944. From the German perspective, maintaining the deception required continuous labor and material. Dummy aircraft rotted in fields, painted runways faded, and lighting systems needed fuel and servicing. The Germans sometimes recycled materials, moving wooden planes from one decoy to another, repainting runways, or modifying layouts to adapt to Allied observation patterns. This maintenance cost, while lower than constructing fortifications or manufacturing real aircraft, nevertheless tied up manpower and scarce materials. Thus, the cost-benefit calculus for German command involved weighing the resource investment in deception against the likelihood of diverting Allied attacks from high-value targets. In constrained wartime economies, even small repeated savings, a factory spared for a week, a runway intact for months, could be strategically useful. Comparisons with other deception methods are instructive. Dummy airfields differed from simpler camouflage by being proactive rather than passive. They did not try to hide, they tried to attract. That made them uniquely valuable when used in conjunction with other measures: dispersal, rapid repair teams, and the construction of redundant facilities. For example, a successful decoy might gain the Luftwaffe time to relocate aircraft or to repair a lightly damaged real field. When combined with rapid patching methods for runways and quick dispersal tactics for aircraft, camouflaged revetments, or alternate fields, decoys multiplied the survivability of German air assets. Yet there were clear limitations. Larger, well-resourced bomber forces with improving reconnaissance techniques gradually reduced the efficacy of pure visual deception. The steady increase in mission scale, bigger formations, longer ranges, and more sophisticated electronic aids meant that deception had diminishing marginal returns as the war progressed. Moreover, the strategic bombing campaign scale made it hard for any single deception tactic to be decisive. Dummy airfields could protect a particular base or factory for a time, but they could not stop the cumulative attrition of sustained Allied pressure across production lines, supply routes, and transportation networks. Historically, the legacy of these deceptions lies less in spectacular single victories and more in what military analysts call friction, the ways in which deception changed the rhythm of operations. Deception forced attention, consumed time, and required the enemy to adapt. The Allies' investment in better reconnaissance, improved photo interpretation, and layered verification processes were direct reactions to deception campaigns. In that sense, fake airfields achieved a strategic objective beyond the immediate. They imposed a cognitive and logistical tax on the Allied air war.
Finally, the lessons for modern warfare are resonant. Contemporary militaries face different sensors and weapons: high-resolution satellites, multispectral imagery, and precision-guided munitions, but deception retains value. Modern decoys are digital as well as physical. False electronic signatures, spoofed communications, and simulated infrared or radar returns aim to mislead precision attackers just as painted wood planes misled visual navigators. The core principle remains the same: create believable alternative realities that cause the adversary to misallocate effort. The German dummy airfields of World War II are early examples of this enduring principle, showing how low-tech ingenuity can force a high-tech adversary to pay a price. In summary, fake aerodromes were not war-winning miracles, but they were effective force multipliers within a certain operational envelope. They saved material and time, misled crews, and forced escalating verification costs upon the Allies. As a component of a broader defensive doctrine, camouflage, dispersal, rapid repair, and counter-reconnaissance, dummy airfields contributed measurable, if limited, benefits. Their story is a reminder that in war, perception can be as important as reality, and that sometimes the most valuable targets are those that exist only to be believed. Story number 2. How the German submarine U-505 fell into an American trap which had been preparing for a long time to capture it alive. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in many ways, a war fought in shadows. Vast expanses of ocean, unpredictable storms, and the constant threat of German submarines created a unique combination of tension and uncertainty for Allied naval forces. German U-boats were central to Nazi strategy, posing a serious threat to Allied supply lines by attacking convoys with torpedoes, stealth, and the well-coordinated tactics of wolf packs. By mid-1944, the United States Navy had realized that simply sinking U-boats was not enough. Capturing a submarine intact could provide access to crucial intelligence, including codebooks, operational orders, and technological secrets that might influence the course of the war. Among the submarines considered for such an operation was U-505, a Type IX-C boat commissioned in 1941 and built at the Deutsche Werft shipyard in Hamburg. The Type IX-C design was intended for long-range operations across the Atlantic. U-505 was 76.76 meters long, with a beam of 6.76 meters, a draft of 4.7 meters, and a surface displacement of 1,120 tons. Its propulsion system consisted of 2 MAN diesel engines for surface travel and 2 Siemens-Schuckert electric motors for submerged operations, allowing a surface speed of 18.3 knots and a submerged speed of 7.3 knots. Its operational depth limit was 230 meters, giving it a significant advantage in evading detection. Armament included 6 53.3-centimeter torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 2 in the stern, carrying up to 22 torpedoes, along with a 10.5-centimeter deck gun and multiple anti-aircraft weapons. The complement of 53 men, all highly trained and experienced in Atlantic operations, added to the submarine's capabilities and made it a formidable opponent. American naval intelligence began a meticulous study of German U-boat patterns, analyzing intercepted radio transmissions, captured documents, and prior engagements with enemy submarines. Analysts noticed predictable patterns in U-boat patrol routes, return schedules, and routines. These observations allowed the U.S. Navy to design a hunting strategy focused not on immediate destruction, but on isolating a single submarine and capturing it intact. This approach required patience, precise coordination, and the integration of multiple assets, including surface ships, aircraft, sonar, and radar. Unlike conventional anti-submarine operations that relied on brute force, the plan aimed to force the enemy into a position where escape was impossible, increasing the likelihood of a live capture. A critical development in the preparation was the creation of specialized hunter-killer groups such as Task Group 22.3, which included destroyer escorts, an escort carrier, and long-range reconnaissance aircraft. These groups were trained for advanced anti-submarine tactics with the explicit goal of capturing a submarine rather than simply sinking it. The personnel involved were assigned highly specific roles. Some were responsible for maintaining continuous sonar contact.
others for deploying depth charges to limit enemy maneuvering, and yet others for boarding operations once the submarine surfaced or was disabled. This level of preparation was exceptional for the time and required months of coordinated training and operational planning. Understanding U-505's technical characteristics was central to the operation. Engineers studied the submarine's propulsion, torpedo systems, hull structure, and emergency mechanisms to anticipate how it could resist capture. Knowledge of these systems allowed planners to develop contingencies for neutralizing torpedoes, securing hatches, and preventing the submarine from diving during the boarding operation. Each crew member of the Task Group 22.3 knew exactly what to do in the heat of action, ensuring a coordinated effort that minimized risk while maximizing the chance of a successful capture. Meanwhile, the crew of U-505 continued their missions in the North Atlantic, operating as part of a wolf pack, a coordinated group of U-boats. U-505 carried out patrols against Allied convoys, sinking several merchant vessels with precise torpedo strikes. Each engagement provided American intelligence with additional data on the submarine's behavior, including speed, depth preferences, reaction to threats, and tactical maneuvers. Analysts use these observations to refine operational models, simulating likely responses to various forms of harassment or attack, thereby improving the odds of isolating the submarine without unnecessary losses. The psychological dimension was also critical. American planners understood that prolonged isolation, persistent sonar tracking, and aerial surveillance could exhaust the crew, forcing them into mistakes or compelling them to surface. Submarine life was claustrophobic, stressful, and isolating. Fatigue, stress, and limited space created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The hunter-killer group's tactics leveraged this psychological pressure, creating situations where the U-boat would have no safe options. The combination of physical isolation and continuous threat would make it increasingly likely that the crew might abandon standard defensive procedures, allowing a boarding team to secure the vessel. The operation was further enhanced by intelligence gained from prior captures and interrogations of German sailors. Analysts studied the routines of U-boat crews, standard operating procedures, and defensive techniques, identifying weak points that could be exploited. They understood that U-505's captain, Oberleutnant Harald Long, while experienced and disciplined, had to follow established protocols for surface transit, night operations, and wolfpack coordination. By predicting these protocols, the Americans could position their ships and aircraft to limit maneuver options, creating a tactical choke point where the submarine's survival depended not just on evasion, but on immediate, calculated response. In addition to human intelligence, the Americans relied heavily on technological superiority. Sonar and radar systems were used in tandem to maintain continuous tracking even when the submarine submerged. Depth charges could be deployed in patterns designed to restrict depth options, forcing U-505 to remain near the surface. Aircraft equipped with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors extended the operational reach of the hunter-killer group, covering areas too large for ships alone. The integration of these technologies with human analysis exemplified a new level of sophistication in anti-submarine warfare, a combination of science, strategy, and patience.
Ultimately, the preparation for capturing U-505 was a multi-layered endeavor. It combined deep technical understanding of the submarine, extensive intelligence gathering, coordinated deployment of specialized forces, and psychological insight into the behavior of its crew. This meticulous approach ensured that when the opportunity to engage U-505 arose, American forces would be ready to act decisively, with a high probability of capturing the vessel intact. It was a strategy that demanded months of careful planning, attention to detail, and seamless execution, demonstrating the level of sophistication that defined late-stage Allied anti-submarine operations in the Atlantic. The groundwork laid during this period was crucial. Without the comprehensive understanding of U-505's capability, crew behavior, and operational environment, a live capture would have been nearly impossible. The combination of strategy, technology, and psychological insight transformed what could have been a simple naval engagement into a carefully orchestrated operation aimed at one of the most significant intelligence coups of the Atlantic War. It is within this context of patient planning, precise coordination, and calculated risk that the story of U-505's eventual capture begins, a story that showcases not just the ingenuity of Allied forces, but the interplay of human intellect, technology, and tactical foresight in the high-stakes environment of submarine warfare. By June 1944, the stage was set for one of the most daring operations of the Atlantic Campaign, the capture of U-505. The meticulous preparation by the United States Navy, spanning months of intelligence gathering, technical study, and tactical simulations, had created an environment in which a single opportunity could be exploited with maximum effect. Task Group 22.3, commanded by Captain Daniel V. Gallery, was operating in the Central Atlantic, a region known for regular U-boat traffic and strategic significance due to the shipping lanes used by Allied convoys. The primary objective was clear: isolate, neutralize, and capture a German submarine intact. This operation required precise timing, coordination between multiple vessels and aircraft, and the ability to adapt instantly to the unpredictable behavior of the enemy. The process began with reconnaissance. Long-range aircraft equipped with radar and visual spotting tools scoured known U-boat transit areas. Intelligence reports had indicated that U-505, a Type IXC submarine, had been active in disrupting supply lines along the West African convoy routes and was expected to return to a mid-Atlantic patrol area. The Americans leveraged prior intercepts of German radio communications, patterns of Wolfpack coordination, and known U-boat transit schedule to anticipate U-505's position. Sonar-equipped destroyer escorts were spread across a calculated grid, ensuring that any attempt by the submarine to evade could be immediately detected. Every ship and aircraft was in position for a dynamic, responsive engagement, a high-stakes choreography demanding absolute precision. When U-505 was finally sighted on June 4, 1944, the operation entered its most critical phase. The submarine had surfaced, likely to recharge batteries and refresh the air inside the hull, a standard procedure that also left it vulnerable. At that moment, the crew of U-505 believed themselves to be in familiar territory, acting according to established protocols: surface travel at a steady speed, routine navigation checks, and readiness for defensive maneuvers if attacked. However, the Americans had carefully prepared for this scenario. Destroyer escorts moved in to cut off escape routes, while aircraft maintained pressure from above, ready to drop depth charges if the submarine attempted to dive. The use of sustained pressure created a psychological effect on the crew, who now faced the possibility of being trapped with limited options for survival or escape.
The engagement began with a series of tactical maneuvers designed to prevent U-505 from diving while minimizing damage to the submarine itself. Depth charges were deployed in a pattern meant not to destroy, but to disrupt and disorient the crew, forcing them to surface and maintain position. This delicate balance required precise calculations. Too aggressive an attack could sink the submarine, nullifying the intelligence value. Too gentle, and the U-boat could escape. The use of sonar allowed American forces to track the exact position of the vessel underwater, adjusting patterns of pressure to limit the range of evasive maneuvers. The combination of continuous tracking, aerial surveillance, and coordinated surface movements exemplified a new level of anti-submarine warfare sophistication, one that integrated technology, human analysis, and tactical foresight. After several tense hours, U-505 was forced to surface. The American task group immediately executed the next phase, the boarding operation. This stage required exceptional courage and coordination. A specially trained boarding party approached the submarine in small boats, fully aware that any misstep could trigger scuttling charges, torpedo attacks, or gunfire from the U-boat. Once alongside, the sailors had to quickly secure hatches, disarm potential explosives, and prevent the submarine from diving. This was a painstakingly precise operation. The boarding team needed to understand the layout of U-505, the location of key systems, and the potential for booby traps, all while working under time pressure and the risk of counterattack. The successful execution of these tasks was as much a triumph of training and discipline as it was of courage. Capturing the submarine intact required immediate action to neutralize internal hazards. German crews had standard protocols to scuttle their vessels to prevent enemy capture, including explosive charges and flooding systems. The boarding party had to identify and disarm these mechanisms quickly. Simultaneously, engines were secured, communication systems examined, and critical documents retrieved. Within this chaos, American sailors displayed extraordinary precision, moving through narrow passageways, shutting down systems, and documenting the vessel for later analysis. The successful capture of U-505 marked a historical milestone. It became the first enemy vessel captured on the high seas by U.S. forces since the War of 1812, and one of the very few submarines seized intact during World War II. The immediate aftermath of the capture revealed the full strategic significance of the operation. On board, the Americans recovered code books, operational orders, and encrypted communication materials. These documents were invaluable for decrypting German naval communications, providing insights into U-boat coordination, wolf-pack strategies, and tactical decision-making. The U-505 also offered a rare opportunity to study German submarine engineering firsthand. Its diesel-electric propulsion system, hull construction, torpedo arrangements, and anti-aircraft defenses provided data that could influence the design and countermeasures of future Allied vessels. Technicians and engineers meticulously documented these systems, laying the groundwork for both intelligence exploitation and technical innovation. From a tactical standpoint, the operation provided multiple lessons in anti-submarine warfare. First, it demonstrated the effectiveness of combining intelligence, technical study, and human psychology in orchestrating complex naval operations. Second, it highlighted the potential for hunter-killer groups to achieve objectives beyond destruction, capturing strategic assets intact. Third, it underscored the importance of inter-service coordination, integrating surface ships, aircraft, and specialized boarding teams into a unified, responsive force. Each of these insights would inform Allied anti-submarine warfare doctrine for the remainder of the war, emphasizing patience, planning, and precision over brute force alone.
The capture of U-505 also had profound symbolic and psychological effects. For American forces, it served as a tangible demonstration of capability and ingenuity, reinforcing confidence in naval operations against a formidable enemy. For the German side, the loss was a stark reminder of vulnerability, illustrating that even highly trained crews operating advanced submarines could be outmaneuvered through superior strategy, coordination, and intelligence exploitation. Importantly, the humane treatment of the captured crew, who were taken prisoner but otherwise unharmed, reflected the operational ethics of the American Navy and maintained the legal standards of warfare while achieving an unprecedented military objective. Transporting U-505 to an Allied port required careful planning and continued vigilance. Towed under escort, the submarine had to be monitored for structural integrity, potential sabotage, and environmental hazards. Once docked, it became a subject of intense study by naval engineers, intelligence officers, and cryptanalysts. The insights gleaned from its capture contributed to improved convoy protection, the development of countermeasures against German U-boats, and the refinement of sonar and radar technologies. The event demonstrated the immense value of a single captured vessel, not just in immediate operational terms, but in shaping broader strategic outcomes for the Atlantic campaign. In retrospect, the operation against U-505 stands as a remarkable example of combined arms,
intelligence-driven strategy, and the interplay of human skill and technological innovation. It was a culmination of months of planning, observation, and tactical experimentation, resulting in a decisive and historically significant outcome. The lessons derived from this operation extended far beyond the immediate capture, influencing subsequent naval doctrine, submarine design, and anti-submarine warfare for decades to come. It remains a testament to the potential of meticulous preparation, the strategic application of knowledge, and the courage required to execute a highly complex operation under extreme conditions. Ultimately, the capture of U-505 was more than a single military achievement. It was a demonstration of how intelligence, technology, and human ingenuity could converge to overcome a formidable adversary. By forcing the submarine into a position of vulnerability, neutralizing its defenses, and securing it intact, American forces achieved what few believed possible: a live capture in the midst of a vast and dangerous theater of war. The operation not only yielded critical intelligence, but also became an enduring example of operational excellence, blending analysis, foresight, and bravery in a manner that continues to inform historical study and military strategy to this day. Story number 2. How the Germans used fake American uniforms in the Ardennes. This time, the story is about how the Germans deceived the Americans. The winter of 1944 brought one of the most unexpected and intense confrontations on the Western Front, the Battle of the Ardennes. For the Allies, it was the height of a bitterly cold December, as American divisions were stretched thin across dense forests and narrow roads, attempting to consolidate gains after months of pushing the German forces back. For the Germans, the situation was desperate, yet ripe for ingenuity. They faced dwindling resources, stretched supply lines, and the ever-present pressure of the advancing Allies. But they also identified an opportunity to exploit the very strengths of their opponents: the discipline, coordination, and, importantly, the predictability of American forces. In this context, a plan emerged that combined audacity with deception. German soldiers would disguise themselves in American uniforms to infiltrate enemy lines, sow confusion, and execute targeted strikes against command posts and supply convoys. The concept of using enemy uniforms was not new in military history. Throughout the wars, deception had been a force multiplier, allowing smaller or encircled units to create disproportionate effects. In the case of the Ardennes, the Germans aimed to combine psychological warfare with tactical disruption. The idea was simple in theory, but complex in practice. A small, highly trained group of German soldiers could penetrate American defensive positions, gather intelligence, mislead units about enemy movements, and even directly interfere with operations, all while appearing to be part of the very force they sought to disrupt. The challenge lay not only in the uniforms themselves, but also in the detail, language, behavior, equipment, and timing. All had to be precise to avoid immediate exposure. German intelligence, primarily through the Abwehr and specialized units, began studying American uniforms in detail. At the time, the typical American infantryman in the European theater wore olive-drab wool uniforms with distinctive insignia, such as the U.S. letters on collars, shoulder patches denoting division affiliation, and a specific arrangement of buttons, pockets, and belts. The soldiers carried M1 Garand rifles, sometimes complemented with M1 carbines or Thompson submachine guns, and their helmets bore netting or winter camouflage covers. For the Germans, replicating this appearance required more than fabric. It demanded attention to every insignia, the cut of the jacket, the type of boots, and even minor details like canteens, entrenching tools, and ammunition pouches. Any deviation could be fatal, immediately revealing the imposters to the keen eyes of American soldiers who were trained to recognize uniform nuances in the harshest conditions. The manufacturing of counterfeit uniforms was a technical operation in itself. German tailors, often from occupied territories with access to American prisoner-of-war uniforms, worked to replicate the texture,
color, and stitching patterns, shoulder patches and division insignia were meticulously copied, sometimes even using stolen authentic patches. Buttons were fabricated to match the unique bronze finish used by the Americans, and field-tested dyes ensured the correct shade of olive drab, even in the dim light of the Ardennes' foggy winter mornings. This attention to detail highlights the seriousness with which the Germans approached the operation. It was not mere a bluff, but a sophisticated attempt at visual and psychological mimicry. Logistics played a crucial role in preparing for the infiltration missions. The units designated for these operations were carefully selected, often comprising men with prior knowledge of English, familiarity with American slang, and previous frontline experience that included interactions with captured American soldiers. Training focused on behavioral accuracy, walking and marching in formation, responding to common American phrases, handling weapons according to U.S. drills, and even adopting the casual demeanor typical of soldiers who were accustomed to winter hardships but not yet battle-hardened in the Ardennes. Mock exercises were conducted behind lines, with officers observing the soldiers' ability to convincingly interact with friendly units without revealing their true identity. Errors, no matter how small, incorrect buttoning, improper saluting, or mispronunciation could mean death when facing alert American units. By early December 1944, as the Ardennes Offensive, later famously known as the Battle of the Bulge, was being meticulously planned, the German command began integrating these disguised units into broader operational strategies. Their primary role was not to engage in large-scale combat, which would expose them too quickly, but to act as force multipliers, scouts, saboteurs, and infiltrators. They were tasked with sowing confusion among the Americans, relaying false information back to German commanders, and assisting conventional units by opening pathways or disrupting communication lines. The uniforms themselves were the linchpin of the plan. Without perfect visual mimicry, these units could not hope to operate safely behind enemy lines.
The first deployments of these disguised soldiers were cautious. In early patrols, small teams would attempt to approach American outposts or isolated convoys, testing the reactions of the sentries. Reports from these initial missions varied. In some cases, the Germans successfully passed checkpoints without arousing suspicion, exploiting the natural chaos of winter operations and the sometimes faltering vigilance of American troops who were themselves fatigued and wary of the weather. In other cases, minor mistakes, such as a mispronounced greeting or unfamiliarity with an American unit structure, alerted sentries and led to firefights. Each encounter offered lessons. Uniforms alone were insufficient. A convincing American soldier required behavioral authenticity, knowledge of unit movement, and a deep understanding of the operational environment. The psychological dimension of these operations was as significant as the physical. American troops, already under pressure from surprise attacks and harsh winter conditions, faced an additional layer of uncertainty: the inability to immediately distinguish friend from foe. Reports circulated of instances where reinforcements hesitated to fire, unsure whether approaching soldiers were allies or disguised Germans. This hesitation could delay defensive responses, allow for the relocation of German forces, or facilitate the theft of supplies and intelligence. German commanders recognized that even minor delays or confusion could amplify the effectiveness of the larger offensive, making the infiltration units a force multiplier beyond their small numbers. One illustrative example involved a German team attempting to pass through a lightly defended crossroads held by American engineers and supply units. Equipped with perfectly replicated uniforms, complete with correct shoulder insignia and winter gear, the team approached under the guise of reinforcements. Initial interactions went smoothly, with American soldiers waving them through checkpoints after brief identity checks. Only when one of the Germans attempted to issue instructions inconsistent with American procedures did suspicion arise, triggering a skirmish. While the operation did not achieve all its goals, it demonstrated both the potential and the peril of relying on disguise. Perfect uniforms could open doors, but the human element,
the ability to convincingly inhabit the role of the enemy, was equally critical. The preparation for these operations extended beyond clothing and behavior. Detailed intelligence gathering informed where and when disguised units should operate. Maps, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations helped identify weak points in American lines and the presence of command posts or supply depots. The Germans sought to strike where the confusion would be maximized and the American response minimized. The interplay between visual deception, behavioral mimicry, and operational intelligence exemplifies the complexity of this effort, illustrating that it was not a simple ruse, but a multi-layered strategy designed to exploit vulnerabilities in enemy organization and psychology. In summary, the use of American uniforms in the Ardennes offensive was a calculated, technically sophisticated approach to deception. It combined meticulous replication of enemy clothing with rigorous training in behavior, language, and tactical operations. Early deployments highlighted both successes and vulnerabilities, reinforcing the principle that in warfare, disguise alone is insufficient without knowledge, skill, and timing. As the Battle of the Ardennes unfolded, these units would continue to play a role in the German attempt to disrupt, confuse, and potentially destabilize the advancing Allied forces, setting the stage for both dramatic encounters and sobering lessons in the limits of deception under the harsh conditions of wartime Europe. The Ardennes operation, therefore, serves not only as a historical case study in tactical innovation, but also as a stark reminder of how psychological and technical ingenuity can intersect on the battlefield, producing both fleeting successes and costly failures.
Once disguised units were in the field, their mission profiles fell into several discrete categories: reconnaissance, sabotage, disruption of logistics, and tactical misdirection. Each role exploited a different vulnerability in the Allied system. Reconnaissance teams used the cover of uniform to approach observation posts and patrols, collecting information on troop dispositions, radio traffic, and the location of vehicles and supply dumps. Sabotage teams targeted fuel convoys, radio stations, and bridges. Disruption squads focused on delaying reinforcements, misdirecting units, or creating false reports. And misdirection teams attempted to feed counterfeit orders into the Allied command chain or impersonate staff officers to change small-scale tactical decisions. The cumulative effect, measured in hours lost, supplies diverted, and morale shaken, was the operational goal, rather than killing large numbers of enemy soldiers outright. Reconnaissance under false colors was deceptively effective because frontline conditions in the Ardennes favored short, local contact over prolonged verification. Roadblocks were often manned by small detachments whose primary concern was keeping traffic moving and protecting vulnerable supply columns. A team wearing accurate M1943 field jackets, correct unit patches, and carrying M1 Garans could, in certain situations, pass for reinforcements or a relief element arriving late from the rear. The Germans exploited this by timing passes during dusk or fog, conditions that reduce visual scrutiny, and by imitating the casual body language and radio brevity common among American patrols. In quantitative terms, even a handful of successful passes could yield significant intelligence, coordinates for artillery targets, timing of convoy movements, or the presence of high-value equipment such as 2.5-ton jeeps and 2.5-ton cargo trucks, assets critical to maintaining frontline mobility. Sabotage operations capitalized on the concentration of American logistics along narrow Ardennes roads. Fuel was a particularly lucrative target. A single 2.5-ton truck carried roughly 200 to 300 gallons of fuel, and destroying a small convoy could immediately affect the operational endurance of a company-sized element. Disguised teams would, for instance, approach fuel convoys under the pretense of coordination, then use time-delayed charges or small arms fire to set trucks ablaze. In other cases, they would sabotage radios and antennae, rendering units temporarily blind to higher-level commands. The Germans paired these acts with well-timed artillery salvos or commando raids, turning localized confusion into tactical gains. The net effect was disproportionate. Removing a few hundred gallons of fuel or severing a radio link could delay a battalion's movement by hours or force commanders to reroute, losing valuable tempo. There were also carefully planned deception operations that attempted to manipulate American command decisions. One tactic involved planting false orders or forged movement requests within captured rear areas. A disguised German courier might deliver a note instructing a logistics company to reroute supplies or, conversely, to hold back at a staging area, causing congestion and delaying frontline resupply. On other occasions, impersonators targeted field engineers or military police, roles that carried authority over convoy passes and roadblocks. By mimicking these roles, German agents could create bottlenecks or allow friendly units to exploit gaps in the American defense. Success in these operations hinged on meticulous attention to administrative detail, the right stamped forms, credible signatures, and plausible phrasing matching U.S. military correspondence. When done correctly, these acts could ripple through a brigade's operations, causing confusion and misallocation of resources.
Concrete examples illustrate both the potential and limitations of these operations. In one documented incident, a small team disguised in American gear approached an engineering unit responsible for bridge repairs. Under the guise of being an American reconnaissance patrol, they were allowed to inspect local routes and were left unsupervised near a temporary pontoon bridge. The Germans then placed incendiary charges on key support pontoons, and when the explosion occurred, the bridge collapsed, cutting off a supply route used by a nearby infantry regiment. This single act forced that regiment to operate at reduced supply levels for 2 days while engineers worked to restore the crossing, an operational setback in a battle where timing was critical. However, not every attempt succeeded. There were cases where the ruse backfired dramatically. American units increasingly reacted by tightening verification methods, challenge and password procedures, more thorough ID checks, and the use of black and white recognition signals for night operations. In several instances, unit-level intelligence or simple observation exposed the imposters because of linguistic errors, mispronounced place names, wrong unit slang, incorrect handling of equipment, loading garons improperly, or mismatched insignia combinations that veterans immediately noticed. Once exposed, disguised teams were either killed in firefights or captured and interrogated. The Germans learned that their methods worked best when aiming for small, quick hits and when operating in the fog of war. Protracted deception increased the chance of detection exponentially. The risks to the disguised soldiers themselves were severe. Under the laws and customs of war applicable at the time, wearing enemy uniforms for the purpose of committing hostilities was a dangerous game. If captured while wearing enemy uniforms during or immediately prior to combat, a soldier could be treated as a spy rather than a lawful combatant, with the attendant risk of summary execution, a grim reality both sides understood. German commanders were aware of this and used disguised units judiciously, often spinning them into roles with a higher chance of extraction or retreat rather than positions where capture was almost certain. Nonetheless, several captured members of such units were executed or died in captivity after being treated as unlawful combatants, a sobering reminder of the human cost of such tactics. Strategically, the cumulative effect of these disguise operations on the Ardennes campaign was mixed. Tactically, they produced local successes, delays in resupply, temporary paralysis of isolated units, and sporadic demolition of critical infrastructure. Psychologically, they amplified uncertainty within American ranks during the early, chaotic days of the offensive. Reports of friendly columns that turned out to be hostile contributed to confusion and overcaution among some units. But when measured against the larger operational picture, German objectives to split the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement, the impact was marginal. The scale of the offensive required sustained gains and secure supply lines. Deception operations contributed to short-term advantages but could not compensate for Allied air superiority, overwhelming material superiority, or the logistical chasm that the German forces faced.
A comparative perspective helps place the Ardennes deception in context. Other World War II deception operations, such as Operation Fortitude before D-Day, were broader in scope and layered across intelligence, radio traffic, and inflatable tanks to create entire phantom armies. The Those operations succeeded because they were part of a strategic, theater-wide deception with robust logistical backing and inter-service coordination. In contrast, the Ardennes uniform-based infiltrations were tactical tools, nimble, localized, and opportunistic. Their successes were therefore ephemeral and highly dependent on conditions, weather, terrain, morale, and the attentiveness of the local American units. Measured strictly in numbers, tonnage of supplies destroyed, miles of roads blocked, or hours of delay, the impact was quantifiable, but too limited to alter the campaign's ultimate outcome. Lessons derived from these operations are multifold. On the practical side, the episode underlines that visual deception can work when combined with detailed administrative forgery and behavioral training. However, it also exposes the vulnerability of such methods to linguistic and procedural validation. For modern readers, the Ardennes case reinforces a timeless principle. Deception multiplies force only when it integrates with intelligence, timing, and the exploitation of localized vulnerabilities. Ethically and legally, the story highlights the moral gray zone of wearing enemy uniforms, a tactic that can yield military advantage, but also exposes participants to severe personal risk and can erode established conventions of warfare. In conclusion, the Germans' use of counterfeit American uniforms in the Ardennes was an expression of adaptive warfare under pressure, skillful in execution, risky in application, and limited in strategic effect. It produced episodes of sharp tactical utility and notable human drama, yet it did not decisively shift the campaign's ultimate balance. The operation remains a striking example of how small units, armed with accuracy in detail and audacity of purpose, can create outsized disturbances in an opponent's operations. The Ardennes thus stands as both a cautionary tale and a study in military creativity, a reminder that in war, ingenuity often exists alongside and is constrained by logistics, law, and the unpredictable human factor.